At the same time, the South African government says Qatar has retracted violence and terrorism statement about Soweto tavern massacre this after calls for South Africa to approach Qatar in a bid to establish whether or not they have any information relating to terrorist activities in the country. This was after Qatar issued a statement saying it condemned terrorism despite the motives following a mass shooting in Soweto, where over a dozen people died at the weekend and 2 others died in Qatari, as we mentioned, 4 others in KwaZulu-Natal. However, Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogues, Thembisa Fakude, says it is worth finding out what Qatari officials knew about the acts of violence. He joins us now to share his thoughts. It's very good to talk to you, Thembisa. Let's talk about that. Did you find it peculiar, the statement? Did it really spring out at you as being odd, as many people have called it?
I think it was odd, but at the same time, I understand that it's probably a copy-paste statement that Qatar often issue when such incidents occur throughout the world. So I wouldn't be surprised if it just copy-pastes, particularly now that it's Eid. It was probably a junior official within the office who decided to, or was instructed to issue a statement of some sort, condemning and in solidarity with the people of South Africa, and it just copy and pasted that statement. So I don't think that it was relevant, particularly now that we know that the Qatar has apologized and withdrew the statement.
Let me just stop you right there. I mean, it is very concerning and quite alarming if, as you say, I know it's conjecture at this point to say that it could be a cut and paste exercise by a junior official, but would that have been sent out to somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, for instance, or is there an underlying prejudice that comes to an incident that occurs on African soil?
Well, I don't want to sound like a spokesperson of Qatar, but having spent time and lived in the country, one can only assume that this was paste copy type of statement. And in this regard, we would have expected that the embassy would have issued a statement if they were really concerned about terrorism activities within South Africa. But having said that, I think I understand that there's been that low-hanging explanation, particularly by Gunface South Africa, blaming this on the proliferation of guns. But it's just too much of a coincidence if you really think about it. The events of the past week, including Enyobeni event, by the way. So we have to be open-minded in terms of looking at the reasons behind this. For me, it's just too much of a coincidence. So kind of Enyobeni, you have Katlehong, you have Eastern Cape, Pietermaritzburg, Enyobeni, Pietermaritzburg, Katlehong, and Orlando, and all of these incidences, we must just blame them, blame the bad guys who are having guns. For me, they seem very coordinated. The fact that you have these people who just come in and shoot people. The other explanation we were given was that perhaps there's some territorial wars due to competition. But if you go to the tavern in Orlando East, that's a very, very poor area, and it's probably the only tavern that's popular in that particular location. So I don't think we should not look at other reasons behind the current spread of violence.
Let me latch on to that then, Thembisa, the issue of, and I was also saying that I find it difficult to see it as a coincidence, particularly the hits on the taverns, pretty much in the same time period, and the modus operandi seemingly the same. A year after we had the uprising, or whatever people may want to term it, a year ago, in the very same provinces. I mean, we often hear about a third force. Is that something that people would be too far-fetched to stray to?
Well, as a social scientist, I wouldn't write it off. We must remember that this is not the first time. In the midnight 2020, you had those coordinated shootings once again. One in Melville, in Parkhurst, and the one at the market, the Mary Fitzgerald Square. So those, again, were not, as far as I'm concerned, were not a mere coincidence. They look, at least from where I sit, as if they were a coordinated kind of attack. So it's something that we need to look at. And I think there's nothing wrong with us mere citizens blaming gun proliferation for this. But I just hope that the police and the intelligence are not looking at this from our perspective, but they're taking a serious look into this to find out precisely what is going on, because there seems to be something going on, including the sabotage that we've seen, which has been reported by ESCOM, for example, the fires that were created over the past couple of months. For me, that's not coincidental. I think there is a much more bigger force. I'm not quite sure what it is, and that's not my job to find out. The job of the police and all the security apparatus in South Africa to make sure that we're all safe, and this kind of speculations don't even visit our minds.
And that's the sad thing, because the conjecture can also foment groups who are looking to destabilize, to further whatever nefarious agenda that they may have. I mean, you've seen so many people say, you know, they were arms stolen in Botswana. Could it be possible that could have made their way to South Africa? We know historically that there have been reports of apartheid-era arms caches reportedly buried in certain sites. There's been the issue of fighting over territory in the taxi industry that's also being thrown into that melting pot. So there are so many reasons which could be legitimate, but it does, you know, add to a sense of insecurity in the country. Just how worried are we against the backdrop of our security cluster having had a finger pointed at them as being incompetent, being inept?
Well, as I said, you know, this is too much of a coincidence, and I'm praying and hoping that the security apparatus in South Africa are not sharing the same type of public opinion that you and I are sharing. I'm hoping that they're looking at this much more deeper than we are doing as social scientists, journalists, and citizens of this country, because it does require some sort of zooming in and finding out exactly what's going on, because this cannot be simply defined as a problem of gun proliferation and machoism that we see happening around South Africa. There is something much more cynical, and I think and hope that the security apparatus in South Africa will look at this and come up with answers and ensure that such incidences don't repeat anywhere else in this country.
As AfriCID, as a think tank, you've obviously done research in various areas, including the entrance of radical groups into certain parts of the continents which are deemed strategic for spreading their network. There have been warnings that South Africa could be a possible corridor of that. Is it vulnerable to that kind of activity? Has there been evidence that this fear is growing or should be growing?
Well, there hasn't been evidence in South Africa. There are certain talks about certain elements that are trying to create some problems within the country, but the South African society has been much more concentrated and mobilized in terms of preventing such radical ideologies from proliferating within our communities. The only worry, of course, is that we've got weak borders, particularly within neighboring countries. And we know what's going on, for example, in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. You never know whether that is spilling over, particularly given the fact that the South African National Defense Force has its troops there trying to maintain some peace and stability together with the Rwandese forces. I mean, the South Africa is leading the SADC peacekeeping mission in Mozambique. So you never know what is happening, whether those elements find themselves within our country. But I think the the weaker borders that we have. I know Minister Motsoaledi is trying very hard to make sure that we strengthen those borders. But given the weaker borders that we have at the moment, one cannot rule that out. That we might just have some elements in South Africa, but I don't think there is a platform ready or fertile enough for those type of mentality to proliferate within South Africa.
Thembisa, as always, thank you very much for your time and your insights. Thembisa Fakude, who is the research fellow and director at AfriCID, that is the Africa-Asia Dialogue, speaking to us about the statement put out by Qatari officials saying they're concerned about terrorism in South Africa following those attacks on taverns in the country. It seems that they've walked back on that statement following South Africa raising questions about exactly what the intent was with that. Was there information that they're not sharing with the country?